Hybrid Cloud Show, episode 28. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So I've seen a few articles in the press, and I'm not going to go and get too political with it, but there seem to be some European governments in particular who are advocating a move away from the US cloud providers. So I thought it was a good chance for us to talk more generally about cloud migrations and how you might take what has been deployed on one of the big clouds, for example, and move it to another cloud. So if we imagine someone's all in on one of the big cloud providers, or maybe a couple of the big cloud providers, and wants to move to something else, presumably something that is not in the US, what kind of options do they have? What kinds of things should they be thinking about? And let's sort of go through that thought process.
Before you even start getting into software architecture and cloud technologies, I think the first thing you look at are regulatory. Does your cloud need HIPAA? Does your cloud need PCI? All that kind of stuff. And then figuring out which of the cloud providers can give you what you need. Most of them should. I know Vultr, like OVH, those should be copacetic for whatever you need. I think that's the first thing to evaluate when looking at different cloud providers.
Maybe one thing to do is have a little walk around your real estate and see how screwed you are, basically. If you've written everything in a very opinionated set of technologies that are very cloud specific, you may have a lot of pain ahead of you. So assessing the world and what you depend on and what those replacements might be is definitely something to do before you write a single line of code or translate anything, because this could be a mountain of effort if you don't plan properly.
Yeah, that was going to be my first thought, Shane, is you know the new cloud meets all the regulatory requirements, but does it have the services you need? And are those services compatible at an API level and at a functional level to the things that you have in your source cloud?
Is there an argument for like not doing the full refactor and moving off a different cloud, but maybe shifting to cloud agnostic technologies while still in the same cloud and then lift and shift to the other technology afterwards? Or am I just adding far more work and a rewrite would be better?
It's funny that you say that, because I was surprised when I first started dealing with a lot of customers in the cloud about cloud migrations. And my assumption had always been that the way people would do that would be to convert everything to be more cloud native and use technologies properly and do that at the same time that they were migrating into the cloud. And in reality, I came across an awful lot of customers that pull everything from the data center into very non-cloudy virtual machines in the clouds because they've got like a data center exit or some other deadline that means they have to get out of those data centers or some other reason to migrate. And then they work on them going from those virtual machines into more cloud native technologies.
And that's what the cloud providers generally recommend, right? Is get the stuff into the cloud, then you get familiar with the tooling, the terminologies, you get kind of your base landing zone, network, permissions, all that stuff set up. So you've got a real strong baseline to build from. And then as you modify applications, you're not trying to understand what does my network have to look like in the cloud or what is my permissions model on top of refactoring and building an application.
And it means that you need to start paying them as soon as you start rather than as you migrate.
Well, yes, there is clearly a bias there. But as you mentioned, when you're looking at a cloud migration, maybe you are coming up with some servers that are end of life, or you are in a position where you have to be out of your data center by a certain point. Maybe it's closing. Maybe it's coming up with some serious capacity constraints. Maybe there is just a disagreement you've had with the colo provider, right? There could be a number of reasons that you just want to get out of there quickly. And most of the big clouds just have an OVMF import function, right? Where you can literally take your VM, export it to an OVMF, and then import it to the cloud. On the flip side, most of them also have some kind of virtual machine migration system, which I've used quite successfully in Azure in the past to shift hundreds of VMs from on-prem Hyper-V into Azure, with basically the downtime being a reboot of the VM plus a little bit of catching up on the replica, which is really powerful.
Yeah, and some of them will help you build your business case on why you should move everything to the cloud. So they've invested in it for good reason, I think.
Yeah, there's all sorts of funding programs around getting those migrations over the line, right? I know AWS have MAP, which often gives you effectively running those VMs for free for the first year or so that you can get in the cloud and then modernize the application off of them. So there's a load of incentives to do it.
Somehow, when talking about leaving the big cloud providers, we've managed to spend the whole time talking about getting into the big cloud providers. So I don't know if we've really achieved the objective. So if we wind back in terms of how people would think about taking those, those estates that they have on the existing big providers and maybe want to move to a different one, we've talked about understanding your estate. What next?
I think for me, step 0 is working out how on earth do I move my data? That's often the really, really difficult part, right? Is I've got hundreds of terabytes or petabytes of blob store. I've got 40, 50 terabyte databases that I need to migrate. What do I do? Because immediately that is a huge cost in terms of egress. So I don't want to mess it up and I want to get it right the first time. And B, the area where there is likely to be parity on the database side, but maybe not likely to be parity on something like object storage side. So there probably is some application refactoring there. Now, I think the database one is somewhat of a solved problem. All of the cloud providers, or certainly all of the big cloud providers, have some kind of database migration service, or there are products like Attunity, which basically will go and do that migration for you in the background. It can even do schema conversion for migration between database engines, stuff like that. So that, to me, feels initially like a solved problem. Obviously, scale and choice of database engine comes into that. If you're running on something like Aurora in AWS, perhaps migrating back to a standard Postgres is a little bit more painful for you because of the way that the storage engine works, but certainly not impossible. And I suppose then you get into the slightly gnarlier problem of API-compatible object storage across clouds, which S3 is the gold standard, but clearly doesn't exist everywhere.
What reasonably sized European cloud provider doesn't have S3?
Well, I was thinking Azure doesn't have anything S3 compatible, for example, but that's obviously still a US cloud provider. But you're right, all of the European cloud providers effectively have their API-compatible copy of S3. And in fact, even people like Cloudflare have got R3, right, if you were really in a pinch and just wanted to get that data moved. I guess this only becomes a problem if you're a Microsoft customer using the native blob storage stuff in that case.
So the other risk we're kind of talking about is like the EU cloud ecosystem is just clearly not as mature as the US. Like serverless technologies I'm thinking of in particular are going to be way behind. Are you going to spend a lot of your time trying to like rebuild something similar but worse using open source technologies rather than the thing that AWS or Azure would give you? Like we're talking about like, oh, we need to get out of the US and move to EU, but actually you're saying I'm going to no longer use any of the best in class cloud providers essentially who have the most mature tool sets and go with something else, which is a big risk for a lot of companies.
Yeah, this all seems like something that is achievable if you're using the CNCF style cloud native technologies, right? If you're using containers, if you're using OpenFaaS, if you're using any of these kind of relatively industry standard tools from an open source point of view. But I think you're right, Shane. If you're using Lambda or Azure Functions or Google Cloud Runner, maybe that's a little bit more of a difficult migration that almost immediately requires some code refactoring.
I'm just thinking if your entire real estate was in something like CDK or CloudFormation, and it's like not only as the technologies that you're depending on may not be compatible, but all the IAC you've written is also now redundant. So it's like this enormous undertaking to take a step back to some extent.
And even if you followed those architectural best practices of loosely coupled applications, how have you done that? Have you used SQS versus using something like Rabbit? There's a whole bunch of complexity that immediately becomes apparent once you've selected a cloud provider, moved a bunch of data over, and then had the, oh crap, how do I orchestrate and how do I even run my code part of the problem come into your head.
I mean, there's two different pieces there, aren't there? And that you're talking about being wedded to a single provider or wedded to a level of service or a level of abstractions and so forth that you can get from all of the big three. So I think there's two different pieces there. Have you wedded yourself entirely to one provider, which has its own set of challenges, but its own kind of benefits of doing things efficiently? Or are you really sitting at a level where those services are not available on the smaller clouds?
It's tough for me to weigh in here because I haven't worked a lot with these European clouds. The biggest ones that I know about are Scaleway, OVH, and Hetzner. I'm looking at some of the websites, and I know Scaleway and OVH Cloud do have serverless capabilities, but to what extent and how seamless the transition that will be, I don't think anybody knows yet.
Yeah, I think we've talked previously about the whole smaller cloud thing. And I think in the sort of guidance we had there, we were talking about checking that it has a Terraform provider, checking those sorts of things. And I think it's the same sort of disciplines, right? Go back and think, what are you using? What tooling are you using? What products are you using? And how does that map onto what's available? And I think, if this becomes a more popular thing, then any of those gaps will start to get filled over time anyway. So I think there's going to be some areas where the big three cloud providers probably stay ahead, and the vast majority of cases, then there will be equivalents from other providers.
Yeah, and I guess then it does come back to the business risk conversation, right? I mean, OpenFaaS seem to have a bunch of documentation about how to migrate your Lambda functions to OpenFaaS, and that's great. But if I'm running a business, how do I weigh that risk of not having the applications I need or having to spend thousands of developer hours on migrating them potentially versus the perceived risk of a US cloud provider versus a European one? I think that's a really difficult problem to try and get even in my head at this point. Am I just that ingrained in this is not a problem that I would decide I don't even want to make the effort to move? I don't know.
It is an interesting thing to think about because it really does just highlight the gulf in terms of capabilities between the US and not even EU, just non-US essentially. Like we are all hugely dependent on those technologies, like to the point of governments being hugely dependent on them. And no one's ever really called out that risk. And it's an interesting thing to think about, I guess.
Well, I think people have called out that risk. There's been a number of discussions, efforts, projects, whatever you want to call it, about more EU-based cloud providers. It's just difficult to get those up and running where there's established players. I think it's an interesting question, though. If you do go to the effort of reviewing your technology stack and making it less dependent on a particular cloud, then all of a sudden some of the other things like being able to more easily replicate your stack on-prem become possible as well. So I do wonder about some of the sort of ways that plays out, but it does seem like for a lot of people who are just looking at this and being like, I'd rather not be with a US provider, there could be some costs there that are hard to justify.
I wonder at what level does it make sense to have a platform engineering team tackle this for you? Does it make sense to have them come up with some sort of internal developer platform that you specify what you need, and then they will work on the back end and they can work on switching it out and just making sure it works for you? I don't know. Maybe for a bigger company.
That will reduce a lot of pain. Having everyone doing things their own way and then everyone kind of responsible for moving across, particularly when you need to maybe move groups of connected systems across cloud providers. Like if there's a centralized place where that can be managed and supported, I think you're going to save yourself a lot of pain, obviously depending on the implementation.
When I thought about this at the beginning, I was wondering if a model might be to just do some of your new stuff on the new providers. And then I started thinking through some of the challenges of that in terms of pieces like Gary mentioned with having your data in the right place and those pieces. But to what extent is that a model that people could follow?
I mean, a POC should be part of any investigation to any cloud. And I think starting with a workload that lends itself to being cloud native would be the first step. Probably identifying which application could be that candidate is probably a couple of weeks worth of work.
I think for me, it comes back to, if you think back 10 years to when we were first looking at applications to migrate to the cloud, we did pick off certain pieces of software or certain workloads which lent themselves to a bit more of a cloud native way of doing things. For me, it was a particular problem that we ran into around scale of an application that was doing large data extracts, but was a particularly bursty workload that lent itself really nicely to running in a container and running in the cloud. And I think maybe a revisit of those first principles is almost what you have to do when approaching this, right? It's which of the applications in our stack make sense to pick up and move, which of the applications in our stack make sense to do some light refactoring, and then which are going to be more involved. And then I think you're right, Sean, it's going to be a case of really spending that time to analyze what do we have in the estate, what are things like data access patterns, how is the application coupled to other applications, is it just an API that something calls, does the latency of moving that from the AWS Dublin region to an OVH machine in Paris matter to us that much? It's those kind of decisions that you have to really think about. And I suppose it is almost that revisit of the first principles that we all learned when building on cloud 10 years ago that we've just kind of forgotten as we've added layers and complexity, and AWS has grown from 20 to 250 services, and we've all just picked the thing that's the best because it was available to us.
I do feel conflicted because I think there is benefit in abstractions, but I also think it's a double-edged sword. And I want to say, like, yeah, why don't you rewrite your serverless stuff to be open fast, and then it doesn't matter where you run open fast, right? Switch your VMs to sound like VMware, and then it doesn't matter wherever you can run it because you can run VMware on any cloud, that kind of stuff. At the same time, you don't get a lot of the advantages that native integration with the cloud can get you. But at the same time, you save yourself from a world of pain when things like this happen.
Well, this was going to be one of the things that gave me a slight pause when you and Shane were talking about, well, why do you not just get the platform engineering team to do this? I'm not a fan of huge levels of abstraction from developers. Now, I get in certain cases it makes a bunch of sense, right? Like, I don't want a developer running their own K8s cluster. I don't want a developer spinning up their own database and massively oversizing the disk and costing me 10 grand a month because they decided that they needed provisioned IOPS of their storage when they just don't. But there does come a point where it is really useful for a developer to have the knowledge of the environment that their code is running in. And I do fear that if you were to just say, we've written a tool and it's available in Cortex and it takes your Lambda code and converts it to OpenFAS, and we've got some well-known patterns to do that, and you just don't tell developers, or you tell them that this is what is happening, but then they don't understand the constraints that they're now working within because you can't scale your K8s cluster as quickly on Hetzner as you could in AWS because whatever scaling plugin you're using isn't available. At what point does that become a problem? Because I think it probably does fairly quickly if you're operating at any sort of scale.
What I'm wondering is the risk you're seeing is that there will be scaling issues moving to a new cloud provider, or some other issues that developers won't understand and it'll be abstracted away from them. Is that what you're thinking, Gary?
Yeah, I'm not so much concerned about the scaling issues, right? That was just a poor example. It's more developers understanding the environment that their code is operating in is something that can be really important, right? So scale is one aspect of that. Knowing that this is now running in a Kubernetes cluster and there are certain constraints around that, or there are certain networking things that they now need to think about that they hadn't thought about before when they were just calling a database through its public endpoint, for example. There are a whole bunch of things that are now introduced that when you're using the Meccano set of a big cloud provider don't necessarily exist to the same extent.
Yeah, you would hope if the platform engineering team was taking this on, they would make those things very obvious and available for engineers to understand, maybe without actually having to hit the actual provider's console. But I suspect that's rare to have that level of maturity, probably moving these things sort of across.
That's what I'm thinking, right? There are anything from platform teams that are just account vending factories to platform teams that abstract everything away, and everything a developer touches is in an IDP somewhere, and they just go to cortex.mydomain.com and they see your heavily abstracted away version of the cloud. I mean, OpenShift was almost that, right? Where they just get to pick the templates you've built in OpenShift, and those are the things they can build with. And that leads to all sorts of problems. Like in my case, the developers were hitting the limits of what a Redis container could do and did actually need to move out to some kind of managed Redis service because they were hitting it that hard. They didn't even realize that was an option because all they had was the thing that was available in the IDP and just assumed that they needed to change their code to work around it. When in fact, it was just a limitation of the way that particular container we'd built as a platform engineering team worked.
I feel like that's pretty reasonable. You as the platform engineering team saw that the developer was misusing the platform or hitting limits, hitting limits, and worked with them to create a better way to do it. That's a great platform engineering team.
But it does take the developers having that level of trust in the platform engineering team to come to them and say, hey, I'm hitting this thing. I'm a good developer. I think that it's because of X. Can you help me? Which, when you're in a migration situation of, hey, we need to be off of Azure by December because government says so, I fear that maybe some of those things won't be quite so open.
You're hitting a whole new pile of rough edges in a completely new product. There's just no way you'll get a handle on all of those.
And it comes back to business risk, right? You know, what is the risk of us staying on a big, scary American cloud versus big, scary European cloud?
But a lot of what you just talked about is the same in a big, scary American cloud, isn't it?
Well, I think it is, but those things are better supported. So chances are, if you're hitting a problem in AWS, millions of other people have also hit that problem, or AWS have tens of thousands of support engineers who can help you around that problem. And sometimes that's also very difficult in one of the big American cloud providers, right, is actually getting the answer to the problem you've got, particularly when that has to go behind the scenes to the team that built the service and they take a while to answer. And there's a level of complexity there, right? But there's also a level of support around that. I do wonder if that exists in the smaller clouds to the same extent, as in, I'm not sure I could go on Stack Overflow and get a very specific answer for a specific problem I'm having with Hetzner or OVH or Scaleway.
Right. I was thinking more that balance of platform engineering teams abstracting away, the underlying technologies that are being used versus giving that flexibility to the developer.
If you think about the level of disruption, I guess, with a platform engineering team that has the devil they already know, and you're adding, say, a new product to your platform, well, it's a contained change. You'll start to learn things, and maybe low risk things will break as you onboard that. But if you're going to move everything across to a new provider, you're hitting all the rough edges of all the products all at once, I guess. So, but it's true of any sort of change like this, really. Like any big shift, you're going to run into these risks. I have a question. When we say move away from US cloud providers, as an example, what about running on AWS Frankfurt? What problem does a company or business hit just moving the data being hosted to Europe? I'm trying to work out what set of circumstances would cause someone to be no to AWS entirely versus no to EU West 1 or whatever, any EU or US West 1, sorry.
It really depends on, I guess, how GDPR compliant they are and how much are they actually going to respect what the governments of Europe are telling them. Does a request for GDPR go straight to AWS Frankfurt, or does it go back to the US and then get farmed out to AWS Frankfurt?
That would go to the company hosting the thing, and then it's kind of irrelevant where the data is, as far as I know.
If what you said is true, then that's going to go to AWS. AWS is American. They're going to be able to enact Cloud Act or whatever stipulation to get that. And then, like you said, it's not going to matter where your data lives.
So there's a number of pieces to it. And I think that, if you actually care about this stuff, then you're going to have to get a better handle on it, right? You're going to have to understand who owns this, where's the legal entity, what's the thing you're concerned about, make sure that risk is satisfied. And I think you're right that there will be use cases where putting your data in the right region with the right protections around it and the right guarantees from the provider is going to be enough. And then there's going to be other, whether it is just politics or whether it is a practical risk, there are going to be other people or governments or whatever who would prefer that their data wasn't ultimately on something that even at the very top of the chain was owned by a company in another country. So I think there's going to be a whole lot of different levels of that risk that different people, organizations, governments are going to be comfortable with. And as always, it's just about making sure that the risks you care about are satisfied by the path you're going to take.
Yeah, you're right, Aaron. It's about risk profile, right? Me as a company running a regulated workload absolutely can probably get around this through something like putting it in the right region, or putting it in a local zone, or putting it on an outpost that has a command and control server that's in a region, right? That isn't the risk profile that we're talking about here. We're talking about concerns from a nation state about running critical national infrastructure workloads on a given cloud provider that may or may not be owned by the US. And I think that's where you get into really tricky waters. If you think about the way that some of these companies are structured, there are often entire separate businesses to operate government workloads or to operate workloads from certain countries. There is that level of isolation, right? There is, in AWS's case, GovCloud, which operates all the US government workloads. There's AWS China, which operates all of their workloads from Greater China. And those are completely separate businesses where your usual AWS account rep doesn't even have access to see those things exist, let alone talk to you about your workloads that are running in them, right? That's the level of threat, I guess, that we're talking about here, is that if you are the Dutch government or an EU nation government and you have a workload running in the public partition of a US cloud provider that is subject to US law, subpoenas, FISA courts, all that kind of stuff, are you comfortable with the risk that that opens up to things like critical national infrastructure? I don't know. You might be, you might not be. But there are also companies that are independent businesses that are operating huge parts of critical national infrastructure or have the ability to seriously disrupt critical national infrastructure that are operating in US owned and run public clouds. And I think it is up to individual nation states to decide their level of comfort with that.
Well, that's probably a good place to wrap things up. But before we go, just a quick thank you to our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. If you'd like to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support, where for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. And sometimes you receive episodes early. If you have any questions or feedback, you can send those in at show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.